On the way back from my brother's funeral, I found my photo taken down from the wall and a note on the couch. "You're no longer part of this family." At Sunday lunch, they laughed. By dinner, they found out the new will had erased them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it really started. The taxi ride from the cemetery felt endless. I stared out the window at the gray November sky, my hands still trembling from throwing dirt onto David's casket. My brother, the only person in this world who had ever truly seen me, truly loved me, gone at 58, taken by a heart attack that no one saw coming. I hadn't lived in this town for 15 years. Hadn't wanted to come back, honestly. But when David called me 3 weeks ago, his voice weak and scared, begging me to come home because he was dying, I dropped everything, left my quiet life in Oregon, my small apartment, my job at the library. I came back to take care of him in those final days, just like he'd taken care of me when we were kids, and our parents were too drunk to notice we existed. The funeral had been a performance. David's wife, Vanessa, playing the grieving widow in her expensive black dress. My nephew Jake and niece Madison, both in their 20s, looking bored and checking their phones during the service.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
David's business partners offering hollow condolences about such a loss to the community. Everyone talking about what a successful man he'd been, how his construction company had built half the new developments in town. But none of them mentioned how he'd spent his last weeks, how he'd refused to stay in the big house with Vanessa, choosing instead a small care facility where I could visit him every day without the family's interference, how we'd talked for hours about our childhood, about regrets, about the family that had never really felt like family to either of us. The taxi pulled into the driveway of David's house, our house. Technically, since I'd grown up here too before our parents died, and David inherited everything. Vanessa had redecorated it completely over the years, erasing any trace of the childhood David and I had shared within these walls. I paid the driver and walked up the front steps, my small suitcase in hand. I'd been staying at a motel for the past 3 weeks, but Vanessa had insisted I come to the house after the funeral, for the family gathering, she'd said with that tight smile she reserved for obligations she couldn't avoid. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside, and immediately something felt wrong. The hallway where our family photos had always hung looked different, bare spots on the wall where pictures used to be. I walked closer, my heart starting to pound. My photo was gone, the family portrait from David's 40th birthday, where I'd flown back specifically to be included, the casual snapshot from Christmas 2 years ago. Even the old picture of David and me as kids, the one he'd always said was his favorite because we looked so happy despite everything, all of them, gone. I heard voices from the living room, laughter, actual laughter, hours after we'd buried David. I followed the sound, my legs feeling unsteady. The entire family was there. Vanessa had changed out of her funeral attire into a casual sweater and jeans. Jake was opening a bottle of wine. Madison was scrolling through her phone, smiling at something on the screen. David's older brother Martin and his wife Carol were sitting on the couch, looking more relaxed than I'd seen them all day. No one noticed me at first. I stood in the doorway, invisible as always, listening to their conversation. "I still can't believe she had the nerve to sit in the front row," Vanessa was saying, her voice carrying that sharp edge it always had when she talked about me. Like she belonged there. "Well, she is his sister," Carol said, but her tone suggested she didn't really believe I deserved that consideration. "Please," Jake snorted, pouring wine into glasses. "When's the last time she even visited? She shows up when he's dying and suddenly she's family again? She never fit in anyway," Madison added without looking up from her phone. "Remember when she came for Christmas that one time? So awkward. Like she didn't know how to act around normal people." I felt like I was going to be sick. This was my family. These were the people I'd grieved with today, the people I'd hugged and comforted and shared memories with. And this was what they really thought of me. "Speaking of which," Vanessa said, and I heard paper rustling. I left her a note, just to make things clear. More laughter, cruel, satisfied laughter. I backed away from the doorway, my hands shaking. There, on the couch where I'd sat during my last visit, was a folded piece of paper with my name on it. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read Vanessa's perfect handwriting. "Margaret, now that David is gone, there's no reason to pretend anymore. You're not part of this family and never really were. We tolerated you because David insisted, but that obligation died with him. Don't expect invitations to holidays or family gatherings. You're no longer needed here, Vanessa." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. 15 years. I'd stayed away for 15 years, building a life far from here, visiting only when David specifically asked me to come, and they'd hated me the entire time. Every smile, every hug, every "we miss you" had been a lie. I could hear them still talking in the living room, their voices getting louder as the wine flowed. "She probably expects to inherit something," Martin was saying. "She always was the type to think the world owed her something." "David was too generous with her," Vanessa replied. "Always sending her money, always making excuses for her choices. Well, that's over now." "What did David leave her in the will?" Carol asked. "A small token," Vanessa said dismissively. "Some of his old books, I think. Maybe a few $1,000s. Nothing significant. The house, the business, the real money, that all comes to me and the kids. They were so confident, so certain that David had left them everything while giving his sister scraps. And why wouldn't they be? That's how it had always been in our family. The successful ones got everything, and people like me got the leftovers." I folded the note carefully and put it in my purse. Then I walked quietly to the front door and let myself out. Behind me, I could hear them toasting something, their voices full of celebration rather than grief. As I stood on the front porch of the house where I'd grown up, looking at the life David had built without me, I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, though that was certainly shattered. Something deeper. The last thread of hope I'd been holding on to, that maybe, somehow, I belonged somewhere. But as I walked back toward town to find another taxi, I thought about those last conversations with David, how he'd gripped my hand and whispered things I hadn't fully understood at the time, how he'd made me promise to wait for the lawyer to call, and don't let them know what we talked about. David had always been smarter than the rest of our family gave him credit for, and he'd always protected me, even when I didn't realize I needed protecting. Maybe, just maybe, he'd done it one more time. I spent that night in the same motel where I'd been staying for 3 weeks, staring at the water-stained ceiling and trying to process what I'd witnessed. The note from Vanessa sat on the nightstand, its words burned into my memory. By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I was going back. Not because I wanted to subject myself to more cruelty, but because David had asked me to stay in town for a few more days. "Wait for the lawyer," he'd whispered during one of our last conversations. "Promise me you'll wait." I'd promised, and I'd never broken a promise to my brother. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold. I knew they'd all be gathering at the house after church, just like they did every week. David had told me about these family dinners, how Vanessa insisted on maintaining traditions that made them look like the perfect family. I'd never been invited to one, of course. Until today. I called Vanessa at 10 in the morning. "Margaret?" Her voice was sharp with surprise. "What do you want?" "I'd like to come to Sunday dinner," I said simply. David always talked about them. I think he'd want me to be there, at least once. There was a long pause. I could practically hear her calculating, trying to figure out how to refuse without looking heartless to her children. "I suppose," she said finally. 1 o'clock. Don't be late." The house looked different in the daylight, bigger, more imposing, like it was designed to intimidate rather than welcome. I rang the doorbell at exactly 1 o'clock, my hands steady despite the churning in my stomach. Jake answered the door, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Oh, you actually came." "Your mother invited me," I said quietly. He shrugged and stepped aside. "Whatever, they're in the dining room." The dining room had been David's pride and joy. He'd built the table himself from oak, large enough to seat 12 people comfortably. Today, there were 6 place settings arranged at one end, with a 7th squeezed in at the far end of the table. My place, clearly. As far from the family as possible while still technically being included. Vanessa looked up as I entered, her smile as fake as her perfectly styled hair. Margaret, so glad you could join us. Martin and Carol were already seated, along with Jake and Madison. They all looked up at me with expressions ranging from mild annoyance to open hostility. No one stood to greet me. No one offered to take my coat. Sit wherever, Vanessa said, waving vaguely toward the isolated chair. We were just talking about David's business partners. They're being so supportive during this difficult transition. I took my seat, feeling like a child being punished. The conversation continued around me as if I wasn't there. Talk of business dealings, social events, people I didn't know and wasn't expected to know. I sat quietly, picking at the pot roast that tasted like sawdust in my mouth. It was during dessert that Vanessa's mask finally slipped completely. "You know," she said, cutting into her apple pie with surgical precision, "it's funny how some people think death changes things. Like suddenly everyone becomes important just because they share the same blood." Madison looked up from her phone, sensing something interesting was about to happen. "What do you mean, Mom?" "Oh, nothing specific," Vanessa continued, her eyes fixed on me. "Just that some people seem to think that showing up at the end entitles them to something, when really, they've never contributed anything meaningful to the family." The table fell silent. Even Jake stopped chewing. I could feel all their eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react. "David and I were close," I said softly. "Especially at the end." "Close?" Martin laughed, a harsh sound that reminded me uncomfortably of our father. "You lived across the country for 15 years. That's not what I'd call close." "You missed his wedding," Carol added, her voice sharp. "His kids' graduations, every important moment of his adult life." "I wasn't invited to his wedding," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you wouldn't have fit in," Vanessa said bluntly. "David knew that. We all knew that. You've never understood how to be part of a family like this." "A family like what?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. "Successful," Jake said, leaning back in his chair with the arrogance of someone who'd never worked for anything in his life. "People who make something of themselves instead of just existing." The cruelty was breathtaking. I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA, who'd grown up hearing the same bedtime stories, who'd mourned the same parents, and I saw nothing of myself in any of them. "David loved me," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "David felt sorry for you," Vanessa corrected. "There's a difference. He was always too soft-hearted for his own good. Always sending you money. Always making excuses for your choices." "What choices?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Living like a hermit," Madison said, not looking up from her phone. "Never getting married, never having kids, working at a library instead of doing something important." "There's nothing wrong with working at a library." "There is when you're capable of more," Martin said. "David built an empire. Look what he accomplished. Look what he left behind. What do you have to show for your life?" The question hung in the air like a knife. What did I have to show for my life? A studio apartment, a job that barely paid my bills. No husband, no children, no legacy that anyone would remember. "She has nothing," Vanessa said, answering for me. "That's why she came running back when David got sick. She thought maybe she could guilt him into leaving her something substantial." "I came because he asked me to," I said, my voice breaking. "Because he was dying and he was scared." "He wasn't scared," Jake said dismissively. "He was practical. He knew you'd never make it on your own without family support." "Which is ending now," Vanessa added, her voice as cold as winter. "The support, the money, the pretending, all of it. David's gone, and with him went any obligation we had to include you in anything." I stared at her. This woman who'd married my brother and taken over his life so completely that he'd barely seemed like himself in recent years. "You really hate me that much?" "I don't hate you," she said, which somehow made it worse. "I nothing you. You're irrelevant. You always have been, except David was too nice to admit it." Martin raised his wine glass. "To honesty," he said. Finally. They all raised their glasses except me. They drank to my insignificance, to my exclusion, to the end of any pretense that I mattered to any of them. I sat there, frozen, watching my family celebrate my erasure from their lives. "Now," Vanessa said, setting down her glass with satisfaction. Let's talk about the real business. The estate planning, the will reading, all those tedious legal matters we have to get through. When is the will reading? Carol asked. Tuesday morning, Vanessa replied. Just a formality, really. David was very clear about his wishes. The house stays in the family, the business continues operating, everyone gets taken care of appropriately. What about her? Madison nodded toward me. David left her some books and a small cash bequest, Vanessa said dismissively. Enough to show he remembered her, not enough to matter. They were so confident, so absolutely certain that they knew what David had planned. I thought about those last weeks, how he'd made me promise to stay in town, how he'd gripped my hand and talked about justice and making things right, how he'd asked me over and over if I understood that he'd always protected me and always would. I should go, I said, standing on shaky legs. Yes, you should, Vanessa agreed. And Margaret, don't expect another invitation. This was a one-time courtesy for David's sake. I walked to the door in silence, my face burning with humiliation. Behind me, I could hear them already moving on to other topics, my departure as insignificant as my presence had been. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard Martin say something that stopped me cold. Should we tell her about the house sale? Not yet, Vanessa replied. Let's wait until after the will reading. No point complicating things unnecessarily. They were selling David's house, the house where he and I had grown up, where we'd hidden from our parents' fights, where he'd taught me to read and I'd taught him to braid friendship bracelets. They were selling it like it meant nothing. I let myself out quietly, but I didn't leave the property. Instead, I sat in my rental car at the end of the driveway, crying tears of rage and grief and something that felt almost like relief, because now I knew exactly who these people were. Now I understood why David had seemed so tired in recent years, so worn down by the weight of pretending to love people who only loved what he could give them. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Ms. Margaret Collins, this is Robert Hayes from Hayes & Associates. I was your brother's attorney. Could you please call me at your earliest convenience? There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mr. David Collins's estate. I stared at the message, David's voice echoing in my memory. Wait for the lawyer to call. Promise me you'll wait. I'd waited. And now, finally, I was about to understand what my brother had really been planning all along. I called Robert Hayes back immediately, my hand still shaking from the family dinner. He answered on the second ring, his voice professional but kind. Ms. Collins, thank you for calling. I'm sorry for your loss. Your brother was a good man. Thank you, I managed. Your message said there were matters to discuss? Yes. Could we meet tomorrow morning? There are some things David wanted me to share with you personally, things that need to be discussed before the formal will reading on Tuesday. Something in his tone made my heart race. What kind of things? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Would 9 o'clock work for you? I agreed, and spent the rest of Sunday evening pacing my motel room, trying to make sense of everything. David's mysterious requests during his final weeks, the lawyer's urgent tone, the family's absolute confidence about inheriting everything. Monday morning, I arrived at Hayes & Associates 15 minutes early. The office was small but elegant, with dark wood paneling and law books lining the walls. Robert Hayes was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. I have quite a story to tell you, and I'm not sure where to begin. Begin with David, I said. Begin with why he made me promise to wait for your call. Mr. Hayes opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. Your brother first came to see me 6 months ago. He'd just received his cancer diagnosis. Cancer? The word hit me like a physical blow. But he died of a heart attack. The cancer caused the heart attack, Mr. Hayes explained gently. David knew he was dying, Ms. Collins. He had maybe a year, the doctors said, but he didn't tell his family about the diagnosis. I stared at him, trying to process this information. Why not? Because he wanted to observe them. He wanted to see how they would treat him, and more importantly, how they would treat you when they thought death was imminent, but not when they knew it was certain. Mr. Hayes pulled out a small recording device. David was a meticulous man. He documented everything. Would you like to hear some of what he discovered? I nodded. not trusting my voice. He pressed play, and suddenly David's voice filled the room. Weaker than I remembered, but unmistakably him. Day 43 since diagnosis. Vanessa spent 2 hours today showing me real estate listings for houses in Oakwood Hills. Says we need to upgrade our lifestyle while we still can. When I mentioned wanting to set aside money for Margaret's future, she laughed and said Margaret had made her choices and would have to live with them. She actually used the word parasite when she thought I couldn't hear. My breath caught in my throat. Mr. Hayes fast-forwarded to another entry. Day 67. Jake came by to discuss our financial future. Brought spreadsheets showing how much money the family would have once I'm gone. Not if I die, when I die. Like it's already a foregone conclusion. Asked point blank when I'm planning to update my will and seemed frustrated when I said I wasn't planning any changes. The recordings went on. Weeks of David documenting his family's behavior as his health declined. Vanessa researching expensive vacations they could take once the estate was settled. Martin and Carol discussing which pieces of furniture they wanted to claim. The kids making jokes about finally getting their inheritance. But the worst recording was from just 6 weeks ago. Margaret called today. She doesn't know about the cancer, and I haven't told her. But when I mentioned feeling tired and having some health concerns, she immediately offered to come help. She said she could take a leave of absence from work, that nothing was more important than making sure I was okay. The contrast between her reaction and my family's is stark. She's worried about my well-being. They're worried about my will. I was crying by the time Mr. Hayes turned off the recorder. Why are you showing me this? Because David wanted you to understand what happened next. 3 months ago, when his condition worsened, he called you. I remembered that call. David's voice, weak and scared, asking me to come home. I dropped everything without question. But he didn't tell you the whole truth, Mr. Hayes continued. He told you he was sick, but he didn't tell you he was dying. And he certainly didn't tell you that his family had essentially abandoned him. What do you mean? Mr. Hayes pulled out another set of documents. Hospital records. David was admitted to Mercy General 4 months ago for what his family was told was routine testing. They visited once. Vanessa came for an hour, spent most of it on her phone. The kids never came at all. He showed me the visitor logs, page after page with only my signature, day after day for 3 weeks. They thought he was unconscious most of the time, Mr. Hayes explained. The doctors had given him strong pain medication that made him seem unresponsive. But David was aware. He heard everything they said when they bothered to visit. I remembered those weeks, sitting by David's bedside, reading to him, talking about our childhood, holding his hand. I'd thought I was alone with my grief. But the family had simply chosen not to be there. What did they say? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Mr. Hayes hesitated. There are more recordings. David had a small device hidden in his hospital room. Would you like to hear them? I nodded, steeling myself. The first voice was Vanessa's, talking to someone on the phone while David supposedly slept. The doctors say it could be weeks or months. Honestly, I hope it's sooner rather than later. This whole thing is exhausting, and I have my own life to live. Jake's wedding is coming up, and I can't plan properly with all this uncertainty. Then Jake's voice. Think he can hear us? He looks pretty out of it. Good thing, because I need to ask about the business. My friend Brad wants to make an offer on the construction company. Says he'd pay above market value if we can close the deal quickly. And Madison. Should I feel bad that I'm not sadder? I mean, I love Grandpa David, but it's not like we were close. And honestly, the inheritance money is going to change everything for me. I can finally quit that stupid job and travel like I've always wanted. The recordings were damning. Hours of David's family discussing his impending death like it was a business transaction, making plans for money he hadn't left them yet, treating his illness as an inconvenience to their social calendars. David heard all of this, Mr. Hayes said quietly, every word. And then he made a decision. He pulled out a legal document from the bottom of the file. He called me to his hospital room and dictated a completely new will. He was very specific about his wishes. I stared at the document, my heart pounding. What does it say? That's what we'll discuss tomorrow at the formal reading. But David wanted you to know the context first. He wanted you to understand that this wasn't a decision made in anger or spite. It was a decision made with complete clarity about who his family really was. Mr. Hayes leaned forward in his chair. Margaret, Your brother loved you more than you knew, and he saw exactly how you were treated by the people who claimed to love him. He made sure that would never happen again. I don't understand. You will tomorrow. But there's one more thing David wanted me to tell you. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in David's careful handwriting. He wrote this letter the night before he died. He made me promise to give it to you before the will reading, so you'd know that whatever happened next was done out of love, not revenge. I took the envelope with trembling hands. Should I read it now? That's up to you, but David's instructions were clear. You should read it when you're ready to understand that sometimes the greatest act of love is protecting someone from people who would hurt them, even if those people are family. I slipped the letter into my purse, too overwhelmed to open it in front of a stranger. What happens now? I asked. Now you go back to your hotel and try to get some rest. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, we'll all meet in the conference room downstairs for the formal reading. David's entire family will be there, expecting to hear how his estate will be divided among them. Mr. Hayes smiled, and for the first time, I saw something that might have been satisfaction in his eyes. They're going to be very surprised. That evening, I sat on the bed in my motel room, holding David's letter. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I thought about everything Mr. Hayes had told me about the months of recordings that revealed my family's true nature. Finally, I opened the envelope. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you're reading this, then Robert has told you about the recordings, about what I discovered in my final months. I want you to know that learning the truth about our family was both the most painful and the most liberating experience of my life. For years, I convinced myself that they loved me, that their coldness toward you was just personality differences. I made excuses for them, protected them, enabled them. I'm ashamed of how long it took me to see what you probably knew all along. You were always the best of us. Margaret. The kindest, the most genuine, the most deserving of love. And tomorrow, you're going to learn that someone finally recognized that. Don't let them make you feel guilty for what's about to happen. They made their choices, just like I made mine. You have nothing to apologize for. All my love, always, David P.S. Remember what Dad used to say about justice? It might come late, but it always comes. Well, little sister, justice is finally here. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Tomorrow, I would face my family one more time, but this time, I wouldn't be facing them alone. David would be there with me, one last time, making sure they could never hurt me again. Tuesday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt almost mocking. I dressed carefully in my only good black dress, the same one I'd worn to David's funeral 3 days earlier. My hands were steady as I applied lipstick, but my reflection showed a woman I barely recognized. There was something different in my eyes, something harder than had been there before. I arrived at Hayes & Associates at 9:30, wanting to be early. Mr. Hayes greeted me in the lobby with a cup of coffee and a reassuring smile. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," I admitted, "and angry and sad, all at the same time. That's completely normal. What you're about to witness isn't going to be easy, even though David believed it was necessary." He led me to a small office adjacent to the conference room. Through the partially open door, I could see a long table with chairs arranged around it. At the head of the table sat a stack of documents and what looked like David's final will. "You'll wait here until everyone arrives," Mr. Hayes explained. David was very specific about the order of events. He wanted them all present and settled before you joined us. At exactly 10 o'clock, I heard voices in the hallway. Vanessa's voice, bright and confident, talking about the beautiful weather. Jake laughing at something on his phone. Madison complaining about having to wake up early for boring legal stuff. Through the crack in the door, I watched them file into the conference room. Vanessa had dressed for the occasion in an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. She carried herself like a woman about to receive very good news. Jake wore a smirk that suggested he was already mentally spending his inheritance. Madison looked bored but expectant. Martin and Carol completed the group, both wearing the satisfied expressions of people who believed their financial futures were about to be secured. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Hayes began, taking his place at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, But David was very specific about wanting his final wishes carried out exactly as he intended. Of course, Vanessa said, smoothing her skirt. David was always so thoughtful about planning ahead. I'm sure he's made provisions for everyone. Indeed he has, Mr. Hayes replied, and I caught the slight edge in his voice. Before we begin, I should mention that there will be one additional person joining us. David specifically requested that his sister Margaret be present for the reading. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Is that really necessary? Martin asked, his voice tight. I mean, David was generous, but surely any small bequest could be handled separately. David's instructions were very clear, Mr. Hayes said firmly. Everyone named in the will must be present for the reading. Vanessa's smile flickered for just a moment. Of course, I just thought it might be easier for Margaret, given that she's not really familiar with David's business affairs. She'll be fine, Mr. Hayes assured her, then looked toward my hiding spot. Margaret, would you join us now? I walked into the conference room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The family's reaction was immediate and poorly concealed. Vanessa's smile became even more forced. Jake rolled his eyes openly. Madison didn't even bother looking up from her phone. Margaret, Vanessa said in a tone that managed to sound both welcoming and dismissive. How nice that David thought to include you. I took the empty chair at the far end of the table, the same position I'd been assigned at Sunday dinner. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Now then, Mr. Hayes said, opening the will folder. Let's begin. This is the last will and testament of David Michael Collins, dated exactly 1 week before his death. 1 week? Carol frowned. I thought David's will was done years ago. Mr. Collins made some revisions to his estate planning in his final weeks, Mr. Hayes explained smoothly. As was his right, of course. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. What kind of revisions? We'll get to that. First, let me read the opening statement, which David wrote personally. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat and began to read. I, David Michael Collins, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revise my last will and testament. Recent events have given me clarity about the true nature of the people in my life, and I wish my final wishes to reflect that clarity. Recent events? Jake interrupted. What does that mean? Let him finish, Martin said sharply. Though he looked troubled, Mr. Hayes continued, to my family who have shown me in my final months exactly who they are when they think no one is watching, I leave you this, the knowledge that your actions have consequences, and that love cannot be assumed simply because of shared blood. The silence in the room was deafening. Vanessa had gone pale under her perfectly applied makeup. I don't understand, she said in a voice that had lost all its confidence. David loved his family. He always provided for us. Perhaps we should continue with the specific bequests, Mr. Hayes suggested. Yes, Vanessa said quickly. Let's just get through this. Mr. Hayes turned to the next page. To my wife, Vanessa Collins, who has shown me that her primary interest in our marriage was financial security rather than emotional partnership, I leave the sum of $50,000. This should be sufficient to maintain her lifestyle until she can secure her next source of income. Vanessa's mouth fell open. 50,000? But the house, the business, the investments. David always said, to my son, Jake Collins, Mr. Hayes continued, who has spent the last 6 months planning how to spend money he hadn't inherited yet. I leave my collection of tools from the garage. Perhaps learning to work with his hands will teach him the value of earning rather than expecting. Jake shot to his feet. This is bullshit. Dad promised me the business. To my daughter, Madison Collins, who has treated my illness as an inconvenience to her social calendar, I leave my collection of books. Perhaps reading about human decency will inspire her to develop some. Madison finally looked up from her phone. Her face flushed with anger. This isn't legal. He can't do this. To my brother, Martin Collins, and his wife, Carol, who have spent years judging my choices while depending on my generosity, I leave $1 each, with the hope that they will find some dignity in their old age. Martin was on his feet now, too, his face red with fury. David's lost his mind. This will is obviously the product of diminished capacity. Mr. Collins was examined by 3 separate physicians in the weeks before his death, Mr. Hayes said calmly. All declared him to be of completely sound mind. In fact, he insisted on video recording the signing of this will to prevent exactly these kinds of challenges. The family was in chaos now. Vanessa was crying, though whether from grief or anger was unclear. Jake was pacing behind his chair, muttering about lawyers and challenges. Madison was frantically typing on her phone, probably texting friends about the disaster unfolding. "There must be some mistake," Vanessa said desperately. "David wouldn't do this to his family. We loved him." "Did you?" Mr. Hayes asked quietly. "Because David has quite a different perspective on that." He pulled out a small recording device, the same one he'd shown me the day before. "David wanted me to play this for you, so you'd understand that his decisions were based on your own words and actions." He pressed play, and suddenly David's weak voice filled the room. "This is day 91 since my diagnosis. I'm recording this from my hospital bed where I've been for 3 days. Vanessa visited for 20 minutes yesterday and spent the entire time on the phone with a real estate agent, discussing which houses we should look at once I'm dead. She actually used the phrase, 'when David's estate settles,' while standing 3 feet from my supposedly unconscious body." Vanessa went white. "He was unconscious. The doctors said." The recording continued. "Jake stopped by this morning, not to check on my condition, but to tell me his friend wants to buy the construction business. He asked if I thought I'd live long enough to sign the sale papers, or if they should start preparing them for Vanessa to sign after I'm gone." "I never said that," Jake protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "And Madison," David's voice continued, "sent me a text message yesterday asking if I could hurry up and die because she's tired of people asking her how I'm doing. She said it was super awkward to keep pretending to be sad." Madison was crying now, real tears of shame and panic. "I was just stressed. I didn't mean it." The recording went on for several more minutes, documenting weeks of callous behavior, selfish planning, and complete disregard for David's suffering. By the time it finished, the family sat in stunned silence. "Now," Mr. Hayes said, "shall we continue with the rest of the will?" "There's more?" Vanessa whispered. "Oh yes, we haven't gotten to the main bequest yet." He turned to a new page, and for the first time since entering the room, looked directly at me. "To my sister, Margaret Collins, who showed me what real love looks like by dropping everything to care for me in my final weeks, who asked for nothing and gave everything, who demonstrated the kind of loyalty and devotion that I mistakenly thought I had from my legal family. I leave the entirety of my remaining estate." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around me. "The entirety?" I managed to say. "The house at 412 Maple Avenue, valued at approximately $800,000. The Collins Construction Company, valued at approximately $2.3 million. All bank accounts, investment portfolios, and personal property, totaling approximately $1.7 million. The entire estate, Ms. Collins, comes to just over $4.8 million. I couldn't breathe. $4.8 million. David had left me nearly $5 million while giving his wife and children almost nothing. The family's reaction was immediate and explosive. "This is insane!" Vanessa screamed. "She manipulated him. She turned him against his own family." "She wasn't even here," Jake added. "She lived across the country. We were the ones who took care of him." "Actually," Mr. Hayes said, consulting his notes, "hospital records show that Margaret visited David every day for 3 weeks during his final hospitalization. The rest of you visited once, collectively, for a total of approximately 2 hours." He looked around the table at their shocked faces. David was very thorough in his documentation. He wanted to make sure there could be no question about his reasoning. Vanessa turned to me, her face twisted with rage. "You did this. You poisoned him against us." I found my voice, though it sounded strange to my own ears. "I never said a word against any of you. I didn't even know he was planning this. David made this decision based entirely on his own observations," Mr. Hayes confirmed. "Margaret had no knowledge of the will's contents until this moment." The room erupted again in accusations and threats. Through it all, I sat quietly, trying to process what had just happened. David had given me everything. Not just money, but power. The power to never be humiliated by these people again. The power to make choices based on what I wanted, not what I could afford. As the family's shouting reached a crescendo, I thought about Sunday dinner, about being seated at the far end of the table like an unwanted guest, about Vanessa's note telling me I wasn't part of the family anymore. They were right about one thing. I wasn't part of their family, but now I didn't need to be. The silence that followed Mr. Hayes' announcement lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then all hell broke loose. "This is fraud!" Vanessa shrieked. Her perfectly composed mask completely shattered. She manipulated a dying man. She isolated him from his family and filled his head with lies. "I want to see those recordings," Martin demanded, his face purple with rage. "I want to verify their authenticity." David would never say those things about his own family. Jake was pacing behind his chair like a caged animal. "This is bullshit. We'll contest this. We'll prove she coerced him. There's no way my father would leave everything to someone who barely visited." "Actually," Mr. Hayes said, his voice cutting through the chaos with professional calm, "David anticipated these exact reactions. That's why he was so thorough in his documentation." He opened another folder and spread several documents across the table. Security footage from the hospital showing visitation patterns, medical records confirming his mental competency up until the day he died, statements from 3 independent physicians, and this. He placed a tablet on the table and pressed play. Suddenly, David's face appeared on the screen, sitting in what looked like Mr. Hayes' office. He was thin and pale, but his eyes were clear and focused. "If you're watching this," David said from the screen, "it means I'm dead, and my family is losing their minds about the will. Let me be very clear. I am of sound mind as I record this. Today is March 15th, exactly 1 week before I plan to die. Yes, I said plan. I'm stopping my medication and letting nature take its course." Vanessa gasped and pressed her hand to her mouth. On screen, David continued, "I want there to be no doubt about my mental state or my reasons for this decision. Vanessa, Jake, Madison, Martin, Carol, you are all watching this because you've shown me exactly who you are when you think no one is looking. Margaret, if you're there, I want you to know that this decision has nothing to do with you manipulating me and everything to do with them showing their true colors." David paused on the recording, taking a labored breath. "For months, I've watched my family plan my funeral like it was a celebration. I've heard them discuss my money like it was already theirs. I've seen them treat my illness as an inconvenience to their social schedules. But most importantly, I've watched how they've treated my sister." I felt tears streaming down my face as David looked directly into the camera. "Margaret came when I called. No questions asked. She left her life behind to take care of me. She never asked about money, never discussed inheritance, never treated my illness like anything other than a tragedy. She held my hand when I was scared, read to me when I couldn't sleep, and made me feel loved in a way I haven't felt from my legal family in years." Vanessa was sobbing now, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of panic, of a woman watching her financial security disappear in real time. "The recordings you've heard are just samples," David continued from beyond the grave. "I have hours of documentation. Vanessa discussing real estate purchases before I was even dead. Jake planning to sell my business. Madison complaining that my dying was inconvenient to her social life. All of it recorded, all of it witnessed, all of it undeniable proof that you saw me as a paycheck, not as a person." Jake suddenly lunged forward and tried to grab the tablet. "Turn it off! We don't need to hear this!" Mr. Hayes calmly moved the device out of reach. "I'm afraid David's instructions were very specific. The entire recording must be played." On screen, David's expression hardened. "I know you'll try to contest this will. I know you'll claim I was mentally incompetent or that Margaret manipulated me. That's why I've taken extraordinary measures to ensure this will cannot be overturned. 3 psychiatric evaluations, all confirming my mental competency, video documentation of the will signing with multiple witnesses, and most importantly, evidence of your own behavior toward both me and Margaret." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You made my sister cry at Sunday dinner. You told her she wasn't part of the family anymore. You removed her photos from the wall of the house where she grew up. You treated her like a stranger at my funeral. And you did all of this while I was still alive to see it. The room was dead silent now, except for the sound of Vanessa's quiet sobbing. Margaret, David said, looking directly into the camera again, I know this is overwhelming. I know you never wanted money or revenge, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about punishing them, though they deserve it. This is about protecting you. With this inheritance, you'll never have to depend on anyone again. You'll never have to accept cruelty from people who should love you. You'll never have to settle for less than you deserve. David smiled, and for a moment he looked like the brother I remembered from our childhood. Use this gift wisely. Help people who deserve it. Live the life you've always wanted. And remember that someone saw your worth, even when you couldn't see it yourself. The video ended, leaving us all sitting in stunned silence. Mr. Hayes quietly put the tablet away and returned to his papers. There's one more thing, he said. David left specific instructions for how the estate transfer should be handled. What kind of instructions? I managed to ask. You have 30 days to decide whether you want to accept the inheritance. If you choose to accept, the transfer will be immediate and irrevocable. If you choose to decline, the estate will be donated in its entirety to the American Cancer Society. She can't decline, Vanessa suddenly burst out. If she doesn't want it, it should go to his family. His real family. Mr. Hayes looked at her with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Collins, your husband was very clear. If Margaret doesn't accept the inheritance, it goes to charity. There is no provision for it to revert to you or your children. But that's insane, Jake protested. We're his blood relatives. We have rights. You have no rights beyond what David chose to give you, Mr. Hayes replied firmly, which, as we've established, was very little. Madison, who had been silent through most of the chaos, suddenly spoke up. What about the house? We live there. Are you saying we have to move out? The house is part of the estate that now belongs to Margaret, Mr. Hayes confirmed. However, David did leave instructions about the transition period. He turned to me. Margaret, David suggested that you might want to give the current occupants 60 days to find alternative housing, but the decision is entirely yours. All eyes turned to me. For the first time in my life, I was the one with power in this family dynamic. I was the one who got to make decisions that affected all of them. I need time to think, I said quietly. Of course, Mr. Hayes nodded. Take all the time you need. Though I should mention that David left one final message specifically for this moment. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name on it. He wanted you to have this if you seemed overwhelmed by the decision. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with David's handwriting. Margaret, remember when we were kids and Dad used to say that sometimes you have to be tough to survive? He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about that. Be tough now. You deserve everything I'm giving you, and they deserve exactly what they're getting. Don't let guilt make you give away what I fought to give you. Love, David P.S. The house has security cameras. Check the footage from Sunday dinner if you need motivation. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Around the table, my family was watching me like vultures, waiting to see what I would do with their future. I'll accept the inheritance, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Vanessa started screaming about lawyers and appeals. Jake threatened to contest everything. Madison burst into tears about how unfair life was. Through it all, Martin sat quietly, his face gray with shock. Finally, he spoke. Margaret, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're family. Surely we can work something out. David was upset when he made this decision. He wasn't thinking clearly. I looked at my uncle, this man who had stood by while his wife called me a failure, who had raised his glass to toast my irrelevance just 2 days earlier. David was thinking very clearly, I said, clearer than he'd been in years. But the business, Jake pleaded. I was supposed to take over the business. It's what Dad always wanted. Your father wanted a lot of things, I replied. One of them was for his family to love him for who he was, not what he could give them. Vanessa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over. We'll fight this with everything we have. "You're welcome to try," Mr. Hayes said calmly, "but I should warn you that contesting the will could be expensive, and David's documentation is quite thorough. You might want to consider whether you can afford a legal battle you're unlikely to win." The truth of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They were broke, or would be soon. The house they thought they owned belonged to me now. The business they thought would support them was mine. The money they'd been counting on was sitting in accounts with my name on them. 60 days, I said finally. "You have 60 days to move out of the house." Vanessa looked like she was going to argue, but Mr. Hayes held up a hand. "That's very generous, Margaret. David only suggested 30. As the family filed out of the conference room, each of them shot me looks that ranged from pleading to murderous. But for the first time in my life, their opinions didn't matter. Their approval didn't matter. Their acceptance didn't matter. I was finally free. After they left, Mr. Hayes and I sat alone in the quiet conference room. "How do you feel?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "Terrified," I admitted, "and guilty, and angry, and—" I paused, searching for the right word. "Powerful. I feel powerful for the first time in my life." "David would be proud," Mr. Hayes said softly. "He spent months planning this, making sure everything was perfect. He wanted you to have choices, Margaret. Real choices." I nodded, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "What happens now? Now you start your new life. The life David wanted you to have." As I walked out of the law office into the bright afternoon sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not just hope for a better future, but certainty that I had the power to create it. Behind me, the conference room where my old life had died stood empty. Ahead of me, a new world waited. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The house felt different now that it was truly mine. Lighter, somehow, like a weight had been lifted from its walls, along with the people who had made it feel cold and unwelcoming. The transition hadn't been smooth. The 60 days I'd given Vanessa and her children to move out had been filled with daily phone calls, angry visits, and increasingly desperate attempts at manipulation. They'd tried everything: guilt, threats, lawyers, and even appeals to distant relatives to intervene on their behalf. None of it had worked. The legal challenges Mr. Hayes had predicted materialized exactly as he'd said they would. Vanessa hired an expensive attorney with money she didn't have, certain she could prove David had been mentally incompetent or that I had somehow coerced him. The lawyer took her retainer, reviewed David's extensive documentation, and quietly advised her to accept the will's terms. She'd fired him and hired another one. Same result. Jake had tried a different approach, showing up at my motel room one night with tears in his eyes and a speech about family loyalty that might have been convincing if I hadn't heard his recorded voice discussing selling his father's business while David lay dying. "Please, Aunt Margaret," he'd begged. "Just the business. Let me keep the business. It's all I know how to do." I'd looked at this young man who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenience, who'd made jokes about finally getting his inheritance while his father suffered in a hospital bed. "Learn something new," I'd told him, and closed the door. Madison had been the most persistent, calling me daily with increasingly creative sob stories about her financial situation, her career prospects, her mental health. She'd even shown up at the house on moving day with a therapist in tow, claiming she was suicidal over the stress of her changed circumstances. I'd calmly handed her a list of free mental health resources and suggested she take advantage of them. By the end of the 60 days, they were gone. Vanessa had found a small apartment across town, funded by the $50,000 David had left her. Jake had moved back in with friends, his dreams of inheriting a construction empire replaced by the reality of working for someone else. Madison had taken a job at a local restaurant, her first real employment in years. Martin and Carol had simply vanished, too ashamed to face the community that now knew how they'd treated David's generosity over the years. The house felt peaceful without them. I'd spent weeks walking through rooms that held decades of memories, deciding what to keep and what to change. David's office remained exactly as he'd left it, But I'd transformed Vanessa's sterile living spaces back into something warm and welcoming. The kitchen where I now stood had been the first room I'd renovated. I'd torn out Vanessa's cold granite countertops and replaced them with warm butcher block. The walls, once a harsh white, were now painted the soft yellow that David and I had loved as children. On the refrigerator, I'd hung a collection of photos that told a different story than the one Vanessa had curated. Pictures of David and me as kids, building snow forts and catching fireflies. Photos from my rare visits over the years, both of us laughing at some shared joke. The family portrait from his 40th birthday, where I looked happy and included instead of like an afterthought. My phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. The caller ID showed Mr. Hayes's office. "Good morning, Margaret. I have some news you might find interesting." "Good news or bad news?" I asked, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd eaten countless childhood breakfasts with David. "That depends on your perspective. Vanessa has filed for bankruptcy. Apparently, the legal fees from her failed challenges to the will depleted her remaining funds." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her note telling me I wasn't part of the family anymore. "What about Jake and Madison?" "Jake's been hired by Mitchell Construction, one of your company's competitors. He's starting at entry level, which is apparently quite a shock to his system. Madison is still working at the restaurant, though I hear she's been telling anyone who'll listen that she's planning to write a book about her experience." I almost smiled at that. "What kind of book?" "Something about family betrayal and stolen inheritances, from what I understand. She seems to believe she's the victim in this story." "Of course she does." "There's something else," Mr. Hayes continued. "I've been contacted by a reporter from the local newspaper. Word has gotten out about the will, and they want to do a story about it. Something about family dynamics and estate planning." The idea of public attention made my stomach clench. "I don't want to be interviewed. I told them as much. But you should know that Vanessa has apparently agreed to speak with them. She's been quite vocal about her belief that justice hasn't been served." I sighed, looking out at the garden where David and I had played as children. "Let her talk. The truth is in the legal documents." After I hung up, I walked through the house that was finally, truly mine. In David's office, I sat at his desk and opened the drawer where he'd kept his most important papers. At the very back, I found something I'd missed during my earlier cleaning, a small notebook filled with his handwriting. I opened it to the first page and found an entry dated 6 months before his death. "Margaret called today. She's worried about me because I mentioned feeling tired lately. She offered to come visit, to help with whatever I need." The contrast between her concern and my family's behavior is stark. When I told Vanessa about the call, she rolled her eyes and said Margaret was probably just fishing for money. The irony is devastating. I flipped through pages of similar entries, David documenting not just his family's cruelty, but also my gestures of love and concern. Phone calls asking about his health. Cards sent for no reason other than to tell him I was thinking of him. Offers to visit that he'd declined because he'd known how unwelcome I'd be made to feel. The final entry was dated just days before his death. "Margaret is sleeping in the chair beside my bed again. She's been here every night for 2 weeks, making sure I'm not alone. The nurses tell me she barely leaves except to shower and change clothes. She reads to me when I can't sleep, talks about our childhood when I'm scared. This is what love looks like. This is what family should be. I'm glad I made the decision I did." I closed the notebook and sat quietly in the afternoon silence. Outside, I could hear the sound of children playing in the neighborhood, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze, life continuing, moving forward, despite all the drama and pain of recent months. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Jake. "Aunt Margaret, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I'm starting to understand what Dad was trying to teach us. Working for someone else, having to earn my place instead of being handed everything. It's hard, but it's also kind of liberating. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that maybe some good will come from all this. Maybe we needed to learn what it felt like to lose everything to understand what really matters." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I hope you're right, Jake. I really do. It was the first communication I'd had with any of them that didn't involve demands, threats, or manipulation. Maybe there was hope for some kind of relationship in the future. Not the toxic dynamic we'd had before, but something healthier built on mutual respect rather than obligation. That evening, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I drove to the cemetery where David was buried. His grave was in a quiet corner under an old oak tree, the headstone simple and elegant just as he would have wanted. I sat on the grass beside his grave and told him about everything that had happened since the will reading, about how the family had reacted, about the legal challenges, about the changes I'd made to the house, about how I was finally learning to live without apologizing for taking up space in the world. I never wanted their money, you know, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to say the words. I just wanted them to love me, to see me as worthy of their affection. It took me 53 years to realize that their opinion of me says more about them than it does about me. The wind rustled through the oak leaves above, and for a moment, I could almost hear David's voice. That's my girl. That's the sister I knew was in there all along. I stayed until the sun set, making peace with the past and plans for the future. The Collins Construction Company was thriving under new management I'd hired, people who valued workers and treated them with dignity. The house was becoming a home again, filled with warmth instead of calculation, and I was becoming someone I'd never been before. A woman who knew her worth, who didn't apologize for existing, who understood that family was about love and loyalty rather than blood and obligation. As I drove home through the quiet streets of the town where I'd grown up, I thought about the photo that had been taken down from the wall, the note that had told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. Vanessa had been right about one thing. I wasn't part of their family. I was something better. I was free. The house welcomed me home with warm lights in the windows and the promise of a future built on my own terms. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of people who refuse to see your value. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well despite those who tried to diminish you. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes disguised as an inheritance and a brother's final act of protection. I was home. Finally, truly home. And I was never leaving again.